Welcome to the HR Think Tank, our podcast that uncovers the power a trusted workforce has on team performance, culture, and morale. We gather insights from experts, business leaders, and HR professionals to help you lead your team more effectively. Here's your host, Khai Ngo, CEO of VerifyNow, a trusted provider of background screening services.
Hi Zahra, welcome back to the show again. It's great to have you on board. And today, we're going to talk about recruiting tactics and how holistic screening can create opportunities and trust within the recruitment process. How are you going?
Yeah, good. It's good to be back here. I know last year we spoke about how to do attraction. So it's nice to come back here and now talk about recruitment and some tactics during the recruitment process.
Yeah, and I think one of the big takeaways from this will be, how do you create trust? Why is it important? Either as an employer doing recruitment yourself or as a recruiter doing it for a client. And then we also drill into the questions, the key questions you should be asking. And these are not your stock standard ones. I mean, maybe there'll be one or two, but we really want to look at why ask those questions. Like, what is the positioning of it? What are you hoping to get out of it?
Yep.
And I think that's what we want our audience to take away from today's episode.
Okay, great.
So let's kick off with, why is it important to create trust during the recruitment process?
Trust is really critical during a recruitment process. If you think about why people are recruiting, or why people, if you think about it from a candidate perspective from the start, a candidate is looking for a job because something has changed in their life. So they're either looking for more money, they're looking for a new leader, or there's something in their life that's changed, which is what's prompting that move. So for them, the decision making underpinning the recruitment process is all led by stressful situations. They say, in life, there's sort of three main stressors. One is buying a house, the other one is a change in the family, and the last one is changing in employment. So it's up there as one of the main stresses. So it's really important to make a candidate feel comfortable, trusted during the recruitment process. I think for clients or for hiring managers. So I think for hiring managers, it's important to create a trusting environment. If you think about why they're hiring, things have changed. So stressful situations again are underpinning their decision making on a candidate. So they're either someone's left in the organization, so people are feeling overburdened, or they're feeling really workload is quite heavy, so they're looking to get more people in. They're growing as a business, so their customers are needing more from them. The other thing is that they may not have had a successful hire previously, so they really want to make sure that this time they make the right decision. Particularly I think for small businesses, getting a new person into the team is like bringing in a person of the family. In a large organization, a new person can sort of be absorbed into the culture. With a small to medium-sized business, a new person can really affect the culture. So it's really important to get that right decision.
And I suppose it's a bit like life, right? We're all strangers until we become friends or colleagues.
Yeah.
And in this situation, if you're an unknown entity, there's a lot of risk.
Yeah.
Because you're naturally as humans, we go to the worst pessimistic side. We're like, oh my God, what if this doesn't work out? What if this person ruins our company? You think those things, right? That's why a lot of employers like referrals.
Yeah.
If they know that they've got a really good employee, this is an employee's referral, they're like, oh my God. And you can almost see that in the interview process as well. People are generally a bit warmer when it is a warm lead versus when it's a cold lead off a jobs board or off, headhunting or something like that. So that's why it's important for trust.
Yeah.
Right? Is you're trying to get to know the other person, what they stand for, what they can bring to the table, if they're suitable. And there's so many unknowns at the early stages.
Yeah, 100%. We talked, I think, about this in the last episode. Last year, recruitment processes were completely turned on its head. So this year, we've seen some of the benefits of that was we can be really efficient with recruitment processes. But what that means is that, we're running 3 or 4 rounds of recruitment processes electronically, whether you're doing interviews, whether you're doing skills assessment. You've never actually physically met a person. You've never validated their ID. So everything is done digitally. We're moving to a more digital world, and you're making such important decisions about whether this person is going to be right for your organization based on a Zoom interview, based on a skills assessment, or whatever that recruitment process that you've found is to be, good for you. There's a lot of trust that needs to underpin that. So you do need to make sure you can validate that as well.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. Like you said, the hiring manager or the recruiter has to earn the trust of the candidate. Candidate has to do the same But it takes time. Like, it's really hard to do it, in half an hour. I mean, lots of people, trusting people, generally good people, will say, yep, cool, I'll give that person the benefit of the doubt. And then, like you said, there's people who have been burnt during the recruitment or the hiring process, looked great on paper, great at the interview, 1 month in, flop.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and we capture that trauma, that we remember those bad hires. And so that goes into the next round of hires, and we've got to check ourselves, because otherwise you can end up turning a lot of people off because you are so concerned.
Yeah.
So that moves us to the next phase. You covered the why. Let's talk about how. How can you create trust? And I'm talking about from a hiring manager, employer, or recruiter's level.
Yeah.
Right? Let's talk about this at the tactical level. What's worked well for you? Lay out the foundation of trust in the recruitment process for us.
I think from a hiring manager's perspective, the way you can instill trust to a candidate is a couple of things. So number one, I always tell my candidates that this is their interview as well. So as a hiring manager, reinforce that during the interview process. One of the first things I say to a candidate is, this is your interview. You need to make a decision whether you want to proceed with this role as well. So make sure you get an opportunity to ask your questions. Every interview I open, I start with that, because that puts the candidate at ease. It gives them a bit of control back over the process, but then it also opens up for them to let their guard down, and you really get to know the real them. So I think that's a really nice way of doing it. The other thing I would say is, with interview styles, there's a real mix behind whether it should be conversational or whether it should be behavioral, and using specific examples to get an understanding of whether someone can do the job or not. I think you really need to find that right balance. And the questions that you ask during an interview process also gives the candidates insights into what it's like to be there. So, hopefully you're targeting or you're structuring your questions based on different scenarios and situations that the person will encounter during the role. So these are things to be mindful of about creating trust and making the candidate feel at ease.
And Zahra, we're going to get into that shortly as well. It's gone through the specific questions, but some of the ones that I had noted down around building the trust process is, firstly, investing time in the recruitment process itself. So investing time from your perspective as an employer, as a hiring manager, to plan out what is happening.
100%.
How's it going to work? Who's involved? How many steps? What happens once they're preferred? Even with onboarding, who do they report to? What will be the first things that they work on? Like, you need to know the inside out. And if you haven't thought about it, you've just gone with knee jerk, we've just lost a person, so, let's put a job ad up. That's not going to work out well. And as well as that, it's about providing time during the interview process, as you said, to give the candidate an opportunity to ask those questions, because we're certainly seeing that shift, right? A lot of people are getting advice online as well, where they should be asking questions. And I think employees, good employees, high-performing ones, will ask that. Right? But perhaps those with less experience or less confidence may not ask those questions. So I think as a hiring manager, as the interviewer, you should be able to ask that, and make sure you factor that in. Don't just do 15-minute interviews where you're like, in, out. How do you get to know someone?
No, you'd never do a 15-minute interview. Yeah, you're right. Time is critical.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you how long you think people should spend interviewing. The Harvard Business Review generally recommends 2 hours. It doesn't mean 2 hours in one sitting. You can break that up into multiple stages, with a phone conversation. And I'd agree with that. It does take a couple of hours of talking to someone to really get to know them. And is that enough to proceed? Maybe. I mean, if people put their best foot forward, you certainly would. But I think for us, we use the pre-screening or the phone screening process really well. That allows us to focus our efforts on the candidates who do meet the criteria and who possibly will be a good fit. Whereas if we don't do those phone screening, you could end up wasting a lot of time in the actual interview process itself. And it's not just a waste of your time, it's your interview panel plus the candidate. So when I ask you how long you think people should spend time interviewing, what's your advice on that?
I think 2 hours is about right all up. I wouldn't interview one candidate for 2 hours. I think that's way too intensive.
Pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's too intensive and you would just get fatigued. I think if you count phone screening, any skills assessments that you're doing, I would always recommend doing 2 rounds of interviews, whether you do one virtually and one in person, and block them out as 30 to 45-minute interviews. I think that gives a good amount of time that you've met the candidate in total for at least 2 hours over their recruitment journey and process. And 2 hours is a lot. It's 2 hours of your time. It's 2 hours of the candidate's time. So you do want to make sure that you're getting good value during that process.
And, I've seen some places break it up. So instead of doing like interview panels, they'll break into key personnel and they'll have 30-minute chats with each of these. So it could be the hiring manager, it could be their manager, it could be a stakeholder that works with that person. And so they're getting a bit more of a well-rounded view of who they'll be working with, as in who the candidate will be working with.
Yeah.
But it also gives the employers a chance to see how does this person respond to the different personnel, different interests, different priorities. And if everyone says yes, generally that's a good sign.
Yeah.
So people break that up because, people are time poor. It's really hard to get a panel of 3, let alone anyone trying to do a panel of 5 in place to do the interviews.
I think the multi sort of panel in time blocks works really well. You just need to make sure that everyone's asking different questions. Otherwise, from a candidate experience, if everyone says, tell me about yourself or tell me about your CV, you're getting, you're getting pretty like repetitive and fatigued, and you're not going to get a great, but understanding of them if you're asking the same questions, that works really well if you've all got different questions and you're giving a different perspective to the candidate.
And then obviously you can catch up and then debrief and give your scoring.
Correct.
All right, so moving on to another tactic we've got, or a tip, is about finding the right balance between listening and talking. So that's how many questions and the types of questions you ask, but as well as how much you disclose about yourself and the role as a hiring manager. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that. I'll say a few things and then jump in.
Yeah, sure.
It probably seems obvious, but sometimes people, are like, oh, well, I'm on this interview panel. My only job is to ask questions, right? But you're not providing any more value than that. And if you take the advice that you gave us early on, it's about trying to convince the candidate that you are the right fit as well.
Yeah.
And like any new relationship, disclosure builds trust.
Yeah.
If the candidate is perhaps a little bit more reserved, a bit shy, and they've got key questions they want to ask, maybe give them an opportunity to provide those questions before the interview via email. Yeah. Perhaps prompt them by saying, hey, before we start this, why don't I give you a few basic things or facts or commonly asked question, frequently asked question about our team or our role. And then you are volunteering that information and that could prompt further questions, right? But it's about finding that balance, because if you spend the whole interview just talking about yourself and you're in the role, you got no chance. So talk to us about that advice specifically. So
I think we spoke earlier that I think the ideal time frame to interview is between sort of 30 to 45 minutes in one chunk. Ideally, I would say you need about 10 questions during that time. I like to go deep rather than ask lots of questions and just get a superficial level, superficial answer. So I like to ask 10 and go deep. In terms of the right balance. So I think you have to think about the role as well. So, how senior are the people that you're recruiting for? How senior is the role? Is it junior? Because that's also going to change your expectation of whether the candidate's going to ask questions and the type of role as well. You've got to remember that not every high performer is going to be somebody who asks lots of questions. We've spoken about this earlier, Khai, is that some people need a bit more time to think. Some people think more inwardly. So how do you identify the top talent who aren't extroverts and aren't really great at talking themselves up? So there's a bias. There's a huge bias that people who can talk really well will do well in interviews, but that doesn't always transpire into how they perform on the job. So you really need to temper that based on the role and the candidate and the role as well. I think during the recruitment process, you need to think about the questions you ask, because you're also giving candidates snippets of what the role is going to be like. I think you need to sell them the role, and that's part of it, but then you don't want to sugarcoat it too much as well, because if you say everything is great, we just need new people coming in, and you don't really give them a real feel for the role, they get there and they might think, oh my God, where have I come?
Falling down.
Yeah, the sides are falling down. I thought this was a great culture, this was that, and then it's not there. My advice would be during the interview process, talk about what some of the challenges are so that the candidate's got a good idea about what they're actually coming into. But then also, we spoke about this earlier, Khai, is that leadership is one of the key drivers of whether someone chooses a role or not. So show your leadership style as well during that interview. So if things are hard or candidates are coming in and it's going to be a really tough gig because they've lost a few accounts and they need someone to come in and build and generate business, so it's going to be a hard slog, maybe add a question in there which is more something to do with your leadership style and how you'll support them through that. So, you're getting a bit of both.
And I guess on the other side—
Does that answer your question?
Well, the other side we're talking about is the listening part, right? Because we focus a lot on the talking, and the listening is active listening. So when you ask that question, really be engaged in terms of what the candidate is saying and what they're not saying. And if they are saying something good, how they're saying that. It's about having that second layer of questions, that third layer of questions, because you want to probe into how people think, how people got to that conclusion. Because sometimes you ask questions and candidates might be able to answer something at the surface level. And you ask another level, and maybe that's the level of technical expertise that you need, is a really deep one. You should be asking deeper questions then. Otherwise, people can train and practice and they might know something superficially, unless that's okay with it. You're okay with that particular answer. You should be actively listening. I think the tip is, balance between listening and talking. Try to make sure that it's not just one-way communication. I think as an interviewer or a hiring manager, you also need to be skilled enough to know when to cut the candidate off if they're no longer providing value. Some people get really nervous and then they talk themselves into circle.
And they waffle,
And then they put themselves in a bad position, right? Now, if you've done the pre-screening and you've already had first stage and you know this person's good value for your team, help them out a little bit. Don't let them keep digging their grave in the interview process because your other panelists might say, oh, well, this person just waffles. So I think as part of the interview, your role is to guide that conversation as well. You don't know what answers will come, but if you know it's going off track, maybe try to bring it back in. So third one we've got here is specifically, now let's go into the interview questions, which is around focusing on the specifics. So when you're asking questions of the candidates, try not to just ask general ones. I think, we're big users of skills assessment in our team.
We
and
use
so
it.
for things that are skills related, we try to keep that with our skills assessments platform. But let's give a little bit of advice in terms of what we mean when we say ask specifics, focus on the specifics. So for us, we might have a few behavioral questions talking about what people have done in the past, in a previous role with a similar challenge. And we might pose that to them and ask, how did you solve that problem? Who did you involve? What was the result? And what did you learn from it?
What would you do, Khai, if you asked that question and they didn't have an answer for it? Like, how could you rephrase that?
Well, maybe you break it down and you just start at one level, like maybe what was your biggest challenge at your previous role? And you might start off with one answer there, and then you can ask a follow-up question, and then you ask another follow-up question. So if it gets too difficult, and again, you have to assess what the role is. Some people are perfectly happy with a complex question. What do you think about sharing interview questions before the interview? What's your take on that?
Oh, I don't think that's a great idea.
Why? Why do you say that?
I just think that it becomes too scripted. I think people think that it's a test and that it's it just becomes too scripted, and sometimes you don't really get to know the real person. That's what I think about it. I know other people think, well, it gives people a bit more time to prepare their answers. I think that I would really like to get to know the real person, and I would temper my expectations depending on the role and the person based on what answers I get. And so I think as a skilled interviewer, you should be able to sort of ramp your interview up and down based on asking questions rather than having to give candidates pre-questions.
Zahra, one could argue for those that are less extroverted and I guess, less advanced with their interpersonal or communication skills, thinking on the spot, that it might disadvantage them not having it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. So what my advice would be is then phase it out, like do different stages. So if there was a component like you did an assessment or you wanted them to go and take a case study away, give them that to prepare. So I think you can look at it in two different ways. So we did that with our marketing role. If you remember, we actually had a case study. We actually presented it to our candidates so they had time to prepare, look at it, and then come back and present. And so that does cater to people who want to have a think about it rather than think of answers on the spot. So you've got two different measures. True. So I would say have a component of something that you give to them that they can prepare and then have a component of getting to know the real authentic them as well.
Because that's where you want to spend the time, right? Like you want to know what drives people, what makes them tick. What are they passionate about? What they care about?
Yeah.
What they're like as a team player.
Yeah.
Are they a team player?
Yeah.
And look, before I get into the question, last thing I'll say is about the skills assessment. So how to use that skills assessment in the interview? Well, you don't ask those basic skills question. Do you know how to use Excel? Yes, no. Like that is a complete waste of time in an interview process.
Yeah.
What you should be doing is if you've done the skills assessment beforehand, look at some of the complex questions or look at some of the ones where you're like, oh, okay, I'm really interested in their thought process behind this. Ask that. Say, hey, question 2, or we have this question about XYZ. You provide us a really interesting response. We think it's quite insightful. Can you tell us why you provided that response?
Yeah.
And that will then drill down into their level of thinking and you're like, wow, that's amazing. That's their experience that they bring in. That's their qualifications that they're bringing in. That's their life experience that they're bringing in. And we need more of that, That will give you the insight rather than saying, do you know how to use Excel? Yes or no? Like that's not going to provide you as an interviewer any more value. You could have just done that on a form.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess skills assessment, to your point earlier, Khai, that's an environment where they can read the question, absorb the answer, and then come back to it. It's not somebody that's always can think of it on their feet and, think about what the answer should be. So skills assessment does cater to a different, demographic or different lens as well in terms of the picture you're getting about the candidate that you're about to bring in.
Well, now we move to the juicy part.
Okay.
And I hope you're ready for this one. This is about, we were just talking about specifics.
Yeah.
Let's talk about specific interview questions.
Yeah.
And let's break it down, So between you and I, we'll share a range of some of our favorite interview questions. We'll say why and then what we're trying to get from asking this question to a candidate. So I'll go first. A little bit like you, I do like to give the floor to the candidate to say, sometimes people are nervous. Do you have any burning questions?
Okay. So do you say that right at the start?
Yeah. Well, obviously I like to do the intros. I like to give a warm welcome, give the context of who I am, who the other interviewers, thank them for their time. I always like to thank people for their time because time is precious. You don't get that back. But I like to throw it out there. If I can see that they're nervous as well, to say, what questions do you have? And sometimes, if hopefully we've done a sufficient job at the pre-screening, but if for some reason they're still itchy and they have these burning questions, I want to give them that time.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And I think that helps settle the nerves.
Yeah.
And it can create this atmosphere that is more conducive to having a conversation to get to know them.
Yeah.
Right. Because what I find is sometimes people have this question, they're like, don't forget this question. Don't forget this question. And they're holding on to this question and then they're not present.
Yeah.
Right. I like to be present when we do an interview. I find it a little bit like meeting new people.
Yeah.
You want to be there for them. You want to be absorbing, hearing what they're saying because it shows that you value their time and you're respecting their time.
And so what do you think of candidates that take notes during interviews or have pre-written questions there?
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with it. Look, I know everyone answers things different ways. That's why I like the follow-up questions because if you only ask one question and it's the typical question that you get from the internet, they give you a typical response and then you move on. Like you don't get anything out of that. So that's the first one I like to ask. And then I also like to see what makes people tick, right? And sometimes I'll ask things like what their preparation is for the interview. So sometimes I'll ask, what do you know about the company? What do you know about the role? And how did you prepare for this interview?
Yeah.
Right. That gives me a sense of how much they value this opportunity. Is this just one of 10 opportunities? And so they say, I didn't do any research for this.
Yeah.
And that gives you the care factor.
Yeah.
Their preparedness for an interview.
Yeah.
And if your role requires someone to be organized, care, proactive, that question will give you a sense of whether or not they got that. And if they don't, they'll own up to it. They'll say, look, you only told me yesterday about the interview opportunity. But even then, even if you get told yesterday, there's still a lot that you can do between the time that you got told and the interview tomorrow.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I use that question more as a phone screening question. So tell me about why you've applied for this role.
Yeah.
And the amount of times where I get candidates to say, look, I have no idea. I've applied for so many roles. Tell me a little bit more about the role. And so from the onset, like I already know they've got their foot in lots of different pies at the moment, or their fingers in lots of different pies at the moment, and they haven't really given a lot of thought to the role. So I think understanding the motivation behind it, what prep they've done, this is something where you can really assess how motivated they are for your business, whether there's an alignment between the mission and the values. We talked about, that earlier, to say in other episodes, to say that mission and vision really align people. So if there's an alignment, you're really going to get that from that question.
Yeah. Okay. I've got one more question and then I'll throw it over to you to give some example. So one I like to ask is, what's an achievement that you're proud of? And then people say, oh, work or non-work. I'm like, look, whichever one you want.
Yeah.
I just want to hear what you're proud of. And I think that gives me a sense of what they're passionate about. And sometimes people are different when they speak about something they're passionate about versus something that, is scripted and they're trying to give you the best possible response so they get the job. And you hear people talk about, their achievements in volunteering, or their past achievements in sport, or their current achievements in their current workplace. It's really fascinating to see what people say when they're most proud of. And I mean, have there been times when people said, I'm not really sure? That, I don't know, that doesn't work as well for me, because it means people haven't thought about it or reflected, or maybe they haven't done anything of note. I find that hard to believe, because everyone has something to be proud of.
Yeah.
But I do like asking that question, because you get a sense of people's personality and, the priorities that people care about a little bit more.
Yeah.
Rather than just asking stock standard questions.
Yeah.
So they're the first three that I've got. I'll come back and I'll share a little bit more.
Yeah.
But Zahra, why don't you share with us
some of my questions? Yeah. So one of my favorites, I've probably got a couple that I like to ask as like stock standard. One of them is, if I was to speak to your referees, what is something that they would say that you need to work on, or what is something that they would say you do really well? I find people tend to answer that question really honestly, and it's a more nicer way of saying, well, not what your strengths and weaknesses are, but what sort of insight do you have in terms of your own development. And when you sort of bring the referee in, them people think, oh, maybe they will ask my referee during reference checks, so I'm going to answer honestly. So I feel like that's a really nice way of getting to the honest truth about some people's areas of strengths and development.
That is a good question. I mean, that transports them outside of their own body and tries to look at it from a referee perspective. And generally referees are, previous supervisors or managers. Yeah. And that they should be able to cover, the strengths and weaknesses. Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah. The other one that I really like to understand from a candidate perspective is what environments bring out the best in them. I think I like to understand that because there's so many different work environments. Some people like structure, some people like process, some people don't work well with structure and process. Some people like to work remotely, some people like hybrid, some people like to be in the office. So I want to understand, especially when I'm placing candidates into different clients, I like to understand what environments bring out the best in them, so I can make sure that we're putting them in environments that they're going to thrive in. So it's not like I'm going to trap you because I need to hear what I need to say, but I genuinely want to understand what sort of environments do people thrive in, so that they can be the best they can be in work situations.
And speaking of, the different working environments, because obviously the last few years has significantly shifted how we work. I mean, what are some relevant questions that would help employers who are hiring remote and hybrid. I mean, I've got one here that I've asked, which is around, how have you contributed to the team culture in this current operating environment? And, when I say current, because ours is hybrid and partially remote as well, I like to know, what do people do? Do people just sign off and never talk to anyone again? Or is their working style, no, I like to get to know people. I like to use chat. I like to organize, different conversations with people, even if I don't work with them. That gives me insight into, I guess, how much effort they put in, because you need people who are like social glues or initiators. Not everyone's like that, but you need people who are like that as well. So what sort of questions do you think would be helpful to drill down on that?
I think on the same vein as what you've said is how do you, but I would probably just maybe flip that a little bit and say, can you give me an example of where you've done it previously, so you can sort of understand what sort of process that they've taken. So a question could be, can you give me an example of when you've fostered a team environment in a remote situation, or how do you bring people together in a remote situation? What were some of the what do you think some of the challenges are about working in a remote environment? And then how, let them answer it, and then see what strategies they've got to try and bridge that as well.
So obviously with the interview questions, you want to think about it beforehand. Most organizations that interview regularly will have some sort of question bank. But I think you want to be careful from just templating it and asking the same thing all the time. You need to carefully consider what the role is and what are the main challenges of the role. What are the main skills, I guess, attitudes, experiences that you're looking for, and then tailor that. For me, a big one is accountability. Irrespective of the role, whether it's frontline, mid-management or senior management, for me, accountability really matters. And so one of the questions I like to ask, so anyone future VerifyNow employee, you're going to know this, but I always like to ask, what is the biggest mistake you've made? Why? What did you learn from it? And I can tell you now, I've had some amazing responses from that. And the reason I ask for that is, are you responsible? Are you accountable to your actions? Are you humble enough to share some of this? Like for some people, they see it as, professionally embarrassing, right? But for our team, I'm looking for people who have that humility to say, look, I've made mistakes, but I've also learned from it. And I'll be honest to share it. Whereas I've had people in the interview process, I find it hilarious, but they said the biggest mistake they made was a typo. You're telling me in 10, 5, 15 years of working, your biggest mistake was a typo. Right? So that gives me a lot of insight into what people are like, because we do make mistakes. I mean, we're taking risks. We're trying to innovate. We are going to make mistakes. And if you're not willing to own up and learn from it, that's not a good fit for us. Because then if you're hiding these small things, what happens when there is a genuine mistake at a governance or a compliance level or a WHS level? Are you going to cover that up too? That concerns me. I don't like to take assumptions, so I always try to ask follow-up questions. But that's a big tell for me.
No, I remember that question from our interview. I think that's a really good one actually, especially around that accountability piece. It really does give a lot of insight. I've
got a question here that actually our colleague Jazz asked. He likes it when there's a little bit of a different one that sort of throws people off. It's not a work one. And I think it's more to just test people's positioning or ability to think on their feet. And so one question that he likes to ask, and I'll ask it on his behalf, is do you think zombies should be fast or slow? Or something like that, and why do you think that's the case? Like what's your take on asking a question like that? Because it's like out of the box.
It is out of the box. You know what? It's an interesting one because you really have to remember that the candidate is also making an assessment on you and the questions that you ask. So by asking a question like that, you're giving a feel of who you are as a leader. So if there's a bit of laughter or there is a bit of like humor to your leadership style? I think that's a great question to ask. I think really bringing yourself into the interview will give candidates a bit of, understanding about what you're like to work for them. So for me, I'm not taking that question literally. I'm taking that question as, okay, this leader is somebody who likes to have fun, and it's not always serious and it's not always work. So I think that's what you get from a question like that. Do you have any other questions? Because I want to ask your opinion about sometimes people ask questions to challenge, to see what their thinking is. I've heard this question asked a few times and I've tried it. What's your superpower? What are you better at than anyone else? And why? But what do you think about some of those types of questions that are a little bit more, challenging, less about what you've done, but like what you have, what you possess as a person? I think more and more the conversational style of interviews are becoming more and more like the common, because you said it so earlier that skills assessment is a huge part of recruitment processes now. So you can assess skills to a certain level, to a certain piece. So getting to know somebody and getting to understand their sort of, the way they operate, and you get that more from like a conversational style of interview than like give me a specific example of when you've done XYZ before. I think that, I think that's sort of how it's moving to.
So what tips can we provide to, hiring managers or recruiters here? I mean, maybe I'll take recruiters out because they should be skilled at interviewing. But for hiring managers who are either less experienced or, haven't done it before, what advice can we give them for, running a good interview?
The advice that I'd give to hiring managers who are running recruitment processes is, one, is to try and get the best out of the candidate. So you really want to create an environment where they feel that can be honest and they're not just putting on a show. So try and keep it relaxed. Try and structure the questions with specific examples around what they're going to be doing in the role, so that they've got a taste of what they're coming into, and also you get an understanding of how they're going to respond as well. The other thing I would suggest is try and talk to them about what some of the challenges are going to be, what some of the benefits are going to be, so that they can understand that as well, and give them a bit of information about your leadership style and how you like to operate and what that environment looks like. Because the last thing you would want is someone to come into a workplace thinking it's going to be hybrid, but your expectations is that they're going to be working, from the office 5 days a week. So that's just not going to last.
That's true.
So
if
that balance.
Yeah, and if you need practice. Ask the questions, work with your colleagues. If this is early on in your career and you haven't done as many interviews, practice. I mean, ask some of these questions. Understand why you're asking these questions as well. It's not just about reading the words off the script or whatever it is, right? There needs to be value in that, because if there's no value in it, you shouldn't be asking that question. So that's really helpful. Thanks for that. I mean, are there any last questions you want to throw out there?
I'd be interested. We spoke about this in the last podcast, but I'd be interested to know, would you ask a salary question at this stage in the interview? Where do you think that should fit?
I think it should have been covered pre-screening. Or after this interview.
Okay.
So after you've moved along the process a bit more, that you want this person, and if the negotiation is still open, then you would talk about it. A little bit awkward with multiple people. Because, it is a sensitive topic, and I think you're putting people on the spot. As a candidate, I think it's better to have that one-on-one either with the recruiter, because generally the recruiter has already been given a budget. Right? So you can have that conversation. Me personally, I'm comfortable to have that conversation, but I prefer to separate that salary discussion versus this interview where we're trying to assess someone's suitability.
I agree.
Right?
I agree. I'd pull the salary piece out at the start, or I'd have it at the other end. Like you'd get a ballpark figure, because you don't want to be like this and you've wasted everyone's, time in the interview process. But if you're sort of like this, then you can bring it into this following the interview. And not ruling people completely out because it isn't like a salary complete alignment at the start, because after you've met somebody, you really can understand what value they bring to a business as well.
So this last part is I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about skills assessment that can be done before or after the interview, and also like challenges, or case studies, or assessments, whatever you want to call them. What do you think their role is in supporting the interview process?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of skills assessment. I've grown to really appreciate them as a working in the recruitment space. I think an interview, and historically and still today, people just use interviews as their marker for making a decision on whether someone will be a good fit or not. I think skills assessment gives a different lens. I think all roles have a piece that they can put into a skills assessment. Even leadership roles, you might just plug it into different stages in the process. So yeah, I think skills assessment gives a different frame. It allows you to take some of the, like you said, some of the can you do this job out of the equation of the interview and look at the skills assessment, and really opens up the interview to be more conversational and understanding how you're going to work together. I think background screening has become really important as well, especially, as we've moved into the more digital space of recruitment. People are meeting digitally. We're moving to digital birth certificates, and identity itself is all moving to a digital space. You need some way of verifying that the person you're talking to or you're speaking to is real, and you can validate what they've done, where they've studied, or what they've done in their employment history is correct. So I think taking all those different pieces is the process that you need to, or the journey that you need to take a candidate on to get to that right decision. I think it's important for candidates as well, because that gives them trust in the recruitment process, that there's an invested time in making sure that they're going to be the right person. I've worked with roles before where some people have offered the role straight away in an interview process. That's actually spooked a few candidates because they're like, oh, wow. They haven't had any time to think about it. So it could work for some people, but I know in my experiences, it's also spooked a few people.
And I think, like you said, it's a big change for people. It's a high stress situation. You've just had a great conversation, but you still need time to mull it over.
Yeah.
You could be applying and interviewing for other roles as well. So you want to be able to compare and assess which one fits for you. I mean, I would feel put on the spot if I've just done a great interview and it's my first interview and they've offered me a job.
Yeah, I think it's different if it's the last interview and you've gone through 3 or 4 steps in the journey. But if it's the first time you've met them at the end of the interview, and look, if it's the right fit, it could be the right fit. But it does depend.
Yeah, so we're going to move now to the Fast 5 question. A little bit different for you because we have asked you some of these questions.
I've not prepared any answers for these questions. Okay,
that's okay. So
we'll see what comes out.
I'm not going to ask you. No, actually, no. I'm going to ask you the full 5.
Okay.
The first 2 are the same from last year, but we have changed the second 3.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you again. Are you ready?
Yeah.
What was your first job and why did you get it?
My first job was Red Rooster, and I got it because I lived across the road from it. I literally turned up at their door every day saying, do you have a job for me? So it was literally a convenience and I needed money.
Persistence paid off.
Yeah.
What's something interesting that's not on your CV?
I said this last time. What's not on my CV is that after I finished uni, one of my first jobs was working as a nurse, and I passed out. So I realized very quickly that me and nursing are not a fit. Yeah,
I do remember that.
Yeah.
All right, new questions.
Okay.
What's something you've learned about leadership and working on a team that you would like to teach your younger self?
I think what I've learned about leadership and something that I'd want to teach my younger self. Okay, I think what I've learned about leadership is that it's not to be afraid of being vulnerable. I think over the time, and any time I've been in roles which have had a leadership component to it, I've always not been able to bring that vulnerability because that imposter syndrome comes in. And we've spoken about this, Khai, is that you feel if you show your weaknesses or you show what you can't do, people are going to think you can't do the job. Whereas I think a really good leader is somebody who can be vulnerable to that, but then move on from that and still be able to motivate and inspire people.
Provide a highlight from working in a trusted team.
Okay, and you didn't pay me to say this, but I think for me, like working in a highlight and trusted team is actually working for VerifyNow. Like I know that sounds really corny.
It's going to be on the record now.
No, it's just I work in a remote role with our business. I'm trusted to do what I need to do, and I still have that space. And I spoke about this a couple of days ago, to still be a mum and to work in a trusted environment. That's priceless. To still be a full-time mum and still be an employee who is valued for their their experiences and their attributes. And I've never had that before. It's always tiptoed on each. So yeah.
Nice to hear, and definitely did not pay you for that.
I didn't get paid for that.
Last question. What's the legacy you want to leave behind?
The legacy I want to leave behind. I think I'm going to pull the family card on this. For me, it's, the sort of values that I bring into my kids. I want to be remembered for them. Yeah. And what for them, it'd be a family card.
It's lovely.
Yeah.
Zahra, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
It's been awesome. On today's episode, we had Zahra and myself discussing recruitment tactics and specific interview questions you should be asking. What are some of your favorite questions? Did you like this topic? Let us know your thoughts, and if you had any suggestions for future episodes, please reach out.
Thanks for listening to the HR Think Tank with Khai Ngo. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share our podcast with your network. Check out the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode, or visit the VerifyNow website for more information.